All right, it's 5 after. We have a packed agenda, so we're going to go ahead and get started. And if folks join late, they join late. But for those of you just joining, welcome to the first of 5, the series of trainings, the Skill Up for Climate Action with the 350 Network Council. My name is Amy, she, her, and I'm the Volunteer and JEDI Director at 350 Colorado. And my lovely co-host for today, I will pass it over to her to introduce herself before I start screen sharing and get started.
Yes, thank you, Amy. Hello, everyone. My name is Rachel. I'm the Justice and Equity Intern at San Diego 350. I'm zooming in from Kumeyaay land. I'm really excited to be here with you all today and to learn a lot of information about JEDI and just climate justice in general.
All right. So I am going to share my screen here for a few minutes because we have a fun activity that we're going to do before I turn it over to tech support. So again, welcome to Climate and Environmental Justice Organizing. I invite everyone to acknowledge the land that you are on as we begin this session and important work. I would like to acknowledge that I am on the traditional land of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes. When we talk about land, land is part of who we are. It's a mixture of our blood, our past, our current, and our future. We carry our ancestors in us, and they're around us as you all do. Today, Indigenous people continue to protect and remain in relationship with these relatives and will do so until the end of time. It is vital to honor these beginnings and recognize the ongoing dedication and importance of Indigenous culture within our communities and within the land that we gather, live, learn, and work on. It is important to understand the longstanding history that has brought you to reside on the land and to seek to understand your place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context, as colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. And as we go through these trainings, we're going to be sharing a lot of resources, and don't worry, you will get a follow-up email with this slide deck and with all the awesome resources that are linked in here. And we wrote a, if you'd like to learn how to write your own land acknowledgement, there's a resource linked in here. And you can check it out to help you build your own. And it's just a side note, if you are asking an Indigenous person to do a land acknowledgement for your local group, to please offer some financial reciprocity to the person doing that for you. And you don't always need an Indigenous person to do a land acknowledgement. Y'all can learn how to write them yourselves and give them at your meetings and trainings and events. So just some Zoom logistics real quick. So if you are going to get on Stack, if we're having a question and answer period or we're having a discussion period, use an asterisk, a little star in the chat box to get on what we call Stack to speak or ask a question. You can use ++ reactions to show your agreement and or appreciation for things that are being said. If possible during these trainings, keep your camera on so we're all in the same room, so to speak, but of course, for my neurodivergent fam out there, please disregard that and come on camera as you see fit. Stay on mute when you're not talking so we can reduce background noise as we are recording these sessions. If you need to stand up and stretch, stand up and stretch. If you need to look out the window, please do so and keep to help you ground yourself in this space. Closed captioning is available. You click on the CC on the Zoom toolbar and select Show Sub. The recording and resources will be shared after this session. And then just some meeting nerds, because this can feel like a heavy topic. So we just want to remind folks to practice, to participate, step up, step back, unlearn things, relearn things. Everyone has the right to comfort in these sessions. Remember intent over impact before you say something or comment. Self-transformation, that's what these are about. Be aware of your language, ask questions, wait, mute yourself. If you're able to be on camera, please do so. And no side stuff, like no email, no multitasking. Try to stay present in the space if you can. So this is a quick look at our agenda today. This is introductions and logistics. Right now, we're gonna do some terms and definitions. We're gonna talk about white privilege, positionality, and implicit bias. After LA accomplice, how we can use JEDI in our organizing. And I know that's a big question and everybody has had lately. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how climate justice and social justice are intertwined. We're going to share some resources and then we're going to close. But you may also, after the session, there will be a half-hour kind of train the trainer session that you're welcome to stay for and ask questions and talk to the facilitators so that you can take this training back to your local group and implement this training into your training repertoire. So we're excited about that. So our first thing that we're going to do, and we're going to share this link in the chat. You're going to go to this website and then you're going to use this code and you're going to put in 3 words. What words come to mind when you think of climate justice? And then I actually have to stop sharing because I have to get out of the slide deck and get to the Menti screen. And then it's going to make a word cloud for us, which is really fun. So we're going to do a word cloud together. So yeah, so definitely. And I'll copy that again and put it in the chat for folks. But you're going to go to this website and you're going to use the code 85423200. And then it's going to bring up a little screen with 3 boxes on it. You're going to type in 3 words. And then it's going to fill up our, oh, why is this not working? It should be, I see 7 people have done it already. Let's see if it fills our word cloud. There it goes. You'll type in the code 85423200. And text part, Shimona, just put it in the chat again, Bruce. I love watching these come together as everybody's putting in words. This is awesome. And then it sends me a shot of it. So it'll be a photo. So we'll make sure to share the word cloud photo out to y'all. And I see 75 of you. Oh, good. You didn't have to input the code. That's awesome. Sometimes it wants the code, sometimes it does not. This is a beautiful word cloud. I like how reparations is staying real big up in there. Y'all are on the right track. All right, I'll give it like 1 or 2 more minutes so everybody has a chance to put in their words. All right. This is beautiful. Nice job, y'all. All right. Well, in the interest of time, anybody who hasn't done it yet can keep doing it, and I will share out the photo that it shares of this because it's really beautiful and it really helps ground us in this space when we see a word cloud with all of this beautiful stuff. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to tech support.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for doing that activity with us. It was awesome to see that equity was one of the biggest words in there. And I think that's such a pillar in the work that we do, especially as climate justice activists. So before we start delving deeper into the realm of climate justice, I think it's important that we answer 3 important questions. First, asking, what is JEDI? What does JEDI stand for? And why is it used in this space? So to start, JEDI is an acronym that serves as an umbrella term for principles, ideologies, practices that all uphold qualities of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So JEDI is dismantling barriers to resources and opportunities in society so that all individuals and communities can live a full and dignified life. JEDI is allocating resources to ensure everyone can access the same opportunities. JEDI is acknowledging and understanding all of the differences between us based on how we experience advantages and encounter barriers to opportunities. And lastly, JEDI is fostering a sense of belonging by centering, valuing, and amplifying the voices, perspectives, and styles of those who experience more barriers based on their identities. So in this space, we use the term JEDI in order to amplify the issues and topics that address racial, social, and environmental injustices. By hyper-focusing on the pursuit of justice, equity, inclusion, and diversity, we allow our work to serve as an agent for change that is intersectional and goes towards the liberation of us all. Next slide. As climate and environmental activists, we often interchangeably use the terms of environmental justice and climate justice. It's important that we understand the difference between the two and how they relate to one another. Climate justice has come to the overarching term to be used to define a movement of movements. So it's based on the understanding that our unjust political and economic system creates societal inequities and climate change. So without a focus on correcting injustice, work on climate change addresses only symptoms and not the root causes. Climate justice is a rights-based framework. So that means that we have to advocate not just for the individual liberties of everyone, but for the collective rights of all. So climate justice is environmental justice that fights for the people that have fallen through the cracks. Climate justice is environmental justice that addresses and works hand in hand with racial, economic, and gender justice in order to create a just future for all, not just some. In order to obtain the goal of true climate justice, we must take an intersectional approach to our work to address both environmental, racial, and racial injustices, and to truly understand the different dynamics that cause BIPOC communities to be impacted by climate change at such a detrimental rate. And by doing this, we have to allow ourselves to see how the inclusion of racial justice will allow our work to be more impactful overall. Next slide. A perfect example of how environmental injustice intersects with racial injustice to further oppress Black, Indigenous. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I can do that. My apologies. So a perfect example of how environmental injustice intersects with racial injustice to further oppress BIPOC communities, also referred to as Black, Indigenous, and POC communities, is through environmental racism. Environmental racism is the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on BIPOC peoples. Environmental racism refers to the institutional rules, regulations, policies, and government or corporate decisions that deliberately target certain communities for locally undesirable land uses and lax enforcement of zoning and environmental laws, which result in communities being disproportionately exposed to toxic and hazardous waste based upon race. One second, I'm trying to make sure I'm seeing the chat while I'm going. Environmental racism occurs to people and communities that society have deemed disposable. A journalist by the name of Hop Hopkins actually described the importance of this understanding best. In quote, he said, "We're in this global environmental mess because we have declared parts of our planet to be disposable. You can't have climate change without sacrifice zones, and you can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people. And you can't have disposable people without racism." Next slide. So why is it vital that anti-oppression of all kinds is a pillar of the climate justice movement? It's vital because in order to be true climate activists, we must take responsibility for equalizing power across the board and create spaces where all are encouraged to actively engage, listen, speak, and act with respect. We must learn about the histories and struggles of impacted communities and other groups as told by them. And we must work in solidarity with communities directly impacted by corporate power. Only then will we be fighting for true climate justice.
All right, so we're gonna dive into some heavy topics, fam, but we can do it. All right, so what is white supremacy? White supremacy is the ideology that white people and the ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white people are superior to people of color and their ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions. But just to be clear, white is a socially constructed category of race with no biological or scientific foundation. The racial category white only exists in relation to other racial categories. And the racial category white was created by white power holders to codify the superiority of white people over others. And the definition of it has changed over time and has been, and it continues to be, determined by the people in power. So it's a very powerful social and political construct. And I urge everybody to read the book White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism by Robin DiAngelo, because she identifies these three dimensions of whiteness. And it's really important to understand the structural advantage, a privileged person within society and its institutions. For example, did you know that most CEOs of major corporations, political leaders, and heads of large organizations are white? A standpoint from which white folks look at themselves and others and at society, one that allows them to see themselves as individuals, as just human, and a set of cultural practices that are not named and acknowledged, norms and actions that consistently create and perpetuate advantages for white folks and disadvantages for Black, Indigenous people of color. Next slide. Okay, so what is white privilege? White privilege is the idea that white people in America have certain advantages that people of color do not have. White people can choose not to think about race, and white privilege does not imply that white people do not have to work hard or that everything is just handed to them. Next slide. So it's important to understand that white privilege is not something that you specifically caused, that you personally need to be ashamed of, but it is something to be aware of and not perpetuate. When white people recognize that they were born with an inherent privilege, they can use that to understand the racial climate and be aware and honor the experiences of others. And this is a great resource in here that you can check out later also. It's called White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Backpack. Definitely a must read for everybody trying to unpack that. Next slide. So white folks in North America live in a social environment that protects and insulates them from race-based stress. This insulated environment of racial protection builds white expectations for racial comfort while at the same time lowering the ability to tolerate racial stress, leading to what we refer to as white fragility. So this is a state in which like even the most minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, like triggering a range of defensive moves or feelings. And it includes like the outward display of like emotions, like such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors that are like, if they're argumentative, silence, leaving the situation and not really digging in. And these behaviors in turn really function to reinstate white supremacy. Next slide. So why does white fragility bother folks so much? So it's white people not being able to tolerate discussions about the existence of racism sometimes, being told or called in that what they did, said, wrote, was either racist or hurtful. And the concept always that impact is over intent. Cannot stress that enough. And to develop an understanding of white fragility and white tears, we have to know how they perpetuate harm against people of color and reflect and recognize when it is happening either by you or someone you're with. And we develop strategies to interrupt the white fragility and the white tears. Next slide. Implicit bias, sorry, this is a big one. Implicit bias and racism are related concepts, but they don't have the same meaning. Implicit bias is an unconsciously held set of associations about a particular group. Racism is prejudice against individuals from a specific racial group and can be either explicit or implicit. So implicit bias can lead to implicitly racist behavior, like when a teacher disciplines Black children more harshly than white children, but many individuals harbor implicit biases without ever displaying overt racism. By becoming aware of our own implicit biases and actively resisting them, we can avoid really perpetuating harmful racist stereotypes and prejudices. So like, you know, an example of an implicit bias is the Kansas City Chiefs. Think about the mascots, like we are not your mascot. And to use Indigenous people as mascots for sports teams is absolutely atrocious. And like the things that they do during that game, like the tomahawk chop and the drumming and the things that are sacred to this community, that's perpetuate, that's like in our society, like it's woven in. And going back to that earlier slide, if you remember, you saw the little fish in the fishbowl, and it says the longer you swim in a culture, the more invisible it becomes. And that is something to really think about when you see this. Like it's, yes, it's just an NFL game. Yes, that's the name of the team, but is that something that was an implicit bias because Indigenous people are turned into cartoons so very often and displayed in ways that have nothing to do with our culture, and stealing and using and appropriating culture, like the burning of sage and the drums and the tomahawk chop. Those are all examples of implicit bias. So then on the next slide, we talk about some ways to like how, so you heard this, now we've been talking about this for a few minutes, like how am I going to address my implicit bias? Like how am I gonna address that? So it's becoming aware, and it's about your individual perceptions, stereotypes, and their impact on decision-making. You gotta learn, you know, learn about diverse cultures and get to know your colleagues, your students, your friends, their backgrounds, and always suspend that negative judgment that's going to come in to that space. You know, you listen in really courageous conversations. You do it to increase your knowledge and address your negative perceptions, stereotypes, and attitudes, and recognize that diversity is real, that it's not made up. And this I don't see color, that is also an implicit bias, and that also perpetuates the culture of white supremacy, because in reality, like there is that, and the cultures are different. And in the United States, this really means stepping outside of your box. Like the United States really, like sometimes y'all, this country thinks that it is all by itself in this whole planet. And all they focus on is it's so ethnocentric to the United States that people refuse to acknowledge the cultures, the many beautiful and diverse cultures around the globe. So it's really like taking your perspective and, you know, taking it outside of the US and out of the nationalism. This is where nationalism can come into play, and how it really, really seeps into our culture is that we focus so hard on the nationalism and of, you know, go USA, that we don't see the bigger picture and that we are part of a global community of people. So I think that will really help folks to address their implicit bias as well, like explore different cultures. Next slide. All right, and to keep fighting your own implicit bias, definitely you can Google social psychologist and prejudice expert Patricia Devine. She has this great, her article stuff is great. It talks about how it's a habit and how it becomes so ingrained that you're not aware that it's even there. So then you have to become aware of the habit. And be motivated to change it. It's just like, you know, if you're going to quit smoking, you got to be aware of the habit and be motivated to change. It has to be concrete. You have to focus on positive and negative feelings and factors, and not just your gut feeling. Like you definitely have to dig into and sit with those uncomfortable feelings. But once you do that, no matter how uncomfortable it is or how hard it may feel, once you get to that third step to notice it, that's when your responses and your decisions and that your behaviors that you have been caused by your bias or by stereotypes, you start to really realize, and it like the little light bulb, ding, and then you can talk, you can get out of those stereotypes, and you can really make an effort to assess and think about members of stereotype groups as individuals, and recalling their individual traits and how they differ from stereotypic expectations. That's the important part. All right, next slide. Okay. So directly related to implicit bias is positionality. What is positionality? Have people heard of the term positionality? Where have you heard it before? And just think about like what you think it actually means. So positionality, the actual definition is every position or identity or social, economic, political location that you hold. So when you have to think about this as like a list in your head. So I can use myself an example. I am a woman. I am a mother. I am a sister. I am biracial. I am working class. I am, I'm an atheist. I am a eco-anarchist. I'm a millennial. Like there's all these different, things on how you identify personally. So once you figure out like your positionality, then you can consider like the positions, that what was left out of your list and what are often in those sites of privilege or power. And for myself, like one of the things about me and my positionality that I recognize as a privilege or power is that I am a light-skinned native. And because I'm half Hungarian and I'm half indigenous, I am light-skinned, and I can often, especially in the wintertime, like don't catch me in July or August because I will be dark brown. But in the wintertime, I can definitely, it's easy for people, to just consider me as it's white passing. And so I have to recognize that privilege and power that I hold, but also help other folks in that same position to unpack that within themselves and to use that positionality in a positive way. Next slide. So this is kind of, when you're looking at your positionality, this is how you can kind of figure out like where you sit and like what your positionality affords you. So in the middle, we have our marginalized groups, and these are, people of color, girls and women, our transgender, genderqueer, and gender nonconforming fam, financially poor, working class folks, LGBTQIA+, children, youth, and older adults, like once you get to that older section, non-native English speakers, non-Christians, people with disabilities. Then you kind of go out a little bit and you get out into the privileged groups. And that's, that's people without disabilities. And that's a big one to recognize because we so often just miss that. And even with this training, like me and Rachel were, we were really conscious of making sure that, were we being ableist? So that's one that you really have to, that's an implicit bias you have to work hard at. That one doesn't come easy. And that definitely takes research on your own part and like figuring out how you're perpetuating that. White people, boys and men, cisgender people, wealthy homeowners, upper middle class, heterosexual or straight folks, adults 18 to 65, native English speakers, and the Christians. Definitely that is a privilege. So then these folks use all of these things. You see the little arrows going in to the marginalized groups. And it's, that those groups perpetuate emotional abuse, intimidation and threats, economic abuse. They use children, blaming and minimizing and using their status and using their knowledge of that system to perpetuate that culture. So once you really dig in and you figure out your positionality and you figure out what groups you belong to, then you can start to assist and you can really be an accomplice to the marginalized community. Next slide.
Yes, thank you so much, Amy. And with that understanding of positionality in mind, it's important that we understand how our specific actions and modes of activism land on the communities and people facing these injustices. So when we think of the work that we do, we want to become more conscious of the impact and whether or not our actions truly challenge systems of white supremacy, or can they be improved upon by gaining more knowledge and taking more personal risk. That is why we think it's important to set this distinction between these three categories of actions and how these affect white supremacy as an end goal of liberation. So this graphic that we're seeing here was created by whiteaccomplices.org, and it helps us visually categorize the three ways in which our actions can affect white supremacy and other oppressive systems. So the first section is labeled as actor. So it describes actions that do not necessarily disrupt the status quo. So think of actor as an acting in the sense of performance. So though these actions may not be inherently bad, and they might even be in good nature, the actions that fall within this category do not necessarily challenge pillars of white supremacy. However, they can be used as gateway actions towards the categories of like ally and accomplice, in which there's more personal risk involved and there's more knowledge in the actions that are being made. So our next section, described as ally, describes actions that are more likely to disrupt the status quo than actions that fall within the actor section. So the actions within the ally section really serve as a disruption in spaces that are dominated by whiteness. So let's say it's a space dominated by whiteness. Either you have the ability to disrupt or to educate in that space. So it's important to acknowledge that these actions of an ally are inherently helpful and wonderful in the fight for liberation, but they do have a lot of room for growth. So that's how you can actually get to the last category, which is the accomplice section. And actions that fall within the accomplice section are meant to directly challenge institutional racism, colonization, and white supremacy. So individuals that make actions within this category show an understanding that our liberations are tied to one another, and the actions are informed by, directed, and coordinated with the BIPOC people directly affected by these matters. So these are the brief definitions, but I want to go to an understanding that, sorry, next slide. Yeah, thank you. An understanding that you cannot be one thing all the time. And I want us to really have a reiteration that this is talking about the actions that we're doing and not us as individual people. Because you can change your actions at any moment in time. You can always advance, you can always improve upon. So are you an actor, ally, or accomplice? You can be all three, because one day you might exhibit actions that fall within the actor category in regards to an issue that you might be new to, or you just definitely don't have as much knowledge on it, or it's maybe not your personal experience. But another day you can exhibit the actions of an ally to a marginalized group that's very important to you. And then maybe even another day for a topic that you have a lot more understanding on, you could have actions of an accomplice and work with the community that you know, that you personally are invested in, and work to fight issues that are essential to bringing justice to our shared future. So after going through those definitions, I think it would be helpful to kind of just show some examples of what we mean in these conversations. So I know we can all think back to last summer when the Black Lives Matter movement really hit a peak, and we saw a lot of Black squares on social media. And over time, we saw how that became performative in a sense. Although some people did have good intentions, it wasn't reflecting the work that needed to be done. So when we think of performative, it's not necessarily bad. It's just, it can always be improved upon. There can always be more risk. There can always be more education that happens. Another example was when Nancy Pelosi and the Congress members all knelt with kente cloth. And even though we understand that they were trying to do it in solidarity, it doesn't reflect the policies that they have put in place. It doesn't reflect the work that they are trying to get done. So it just came off very surface level. So if we think about actor, think of surface level. I think that's a really good way to think of it. But it's also important to note that these systems of systems of oppression are challenged when actors shift their actions towards an ally or an accomplice. So you can always improve upon and continue that work towards dismantling white supremacy. So next slide. Yeah, so and a step up from actors or actions that fall within the actor category. Some examples of actions that happen within the ally category can be rallies. So if you have the physical ability to go to a rally and you're there standing with your brethren and just supporting on an issue. So we could think about all the people that went to protests, but especially for other individuals who maybe don't have the ability to go, financial risk is also an important part of allyship. So we see an example in the middle in which a cartoonist decided to draw and make commissions and then donate that to the work that was happening for Black Lives Matter. And I think that's a perfect example of allyship in making sure that you are doing your part, whatever that means, doing your part in this collective goal. Sorry. Yes, and it's important. I'm so sorry, can you go back? My bad, I clicked the wrong slide. And it's important to note that being an ally is not an invitation to be in Black and brown spaces. It's good that you're there to help, but you should allow the Black and brown people in that space to lead and show you which way to go. And once you reach that step, that is how you transition into actions that fall within an accomplice. Cool. So for perfect examples, once again, I think the Black Lives Matter movement really showed great examples of all three of these sections because everyone collectively was trying to do their part in some way. So we got to see the range of things, but a perfect example of actions that fell within the accomplice work was when a lot of white protesters went to the protests and brought milk or things of that nature. And that's where it was like the physical risk of being there for that community. And once again, I think a lot of the times when we talk about accomplice, we have a lot of examples of physically being there, and that's where it can turn into this conversation of ability. So that's why it's important to note that it's not about doing this specific thing. It's about what you can do personally. What is your ability to do in this situation and doing the most that you can. So yeah, so actually Amy mentioned that earlier. That's where a lot of our conversations about ability came in and talking about this. So we really want to reiterate that it's about what you can do and acknowledging where you can do your part in fighting for white supremacy, or not for white supremacy, but dismantling white supremacy overall. And it's important to note that accomplices' actions are informed by, directed, and often coordinated with leaders from the BIPOC communities that are being marginalized. That is a large part of accomplice. All right, next slide. And once again, we just want to reiterate that we are showing these distinctions because we want to show you that there is a next step that you can always do. You can always learn more. You can always advance to another action that's greater in personal risk and more knowledge. So an ally will mostly engage in activism by standing with an individual or group in a marginalized community. But an accomplice will focus more on dismantling the structures that oppress that individual or group, and such work will be directed by the stakeholders in the marginalized group overall. So just some food for thought here. But next, I really want us to take all that we've just learned about ally, accomplice, and even the positionality and everything of that nature, and kind of think about our own privileges and what do we have that we can change and advance upon what we're doing for this work to fight oppression overall. So I do want to ask a pre-question just to get you thinking before we go into our breakout activity. But start thinking about what privileges do you have in your career and personal life? And how do these privileges affect how you navigate in these spaces? So let me put that in the chat. And then... So start thinking of these questions before we go into our breakout rooms. Sorry. Just put in the chat.
All right, tech support here, sending you all in your breakout rooms. If you still need closed captioning while to do this activity, please stay in the main room. Unfortunately, the captioning doesn't work in breakout rooms. So if you need closed captioning, please do not accept the breakout request and just stay back in the main room, and Amy and Rachel will speak with you. So here we go, blast you off.
And if a situation arises that your breakout session requires an intervention from a facilitator, please message the main room or ask for us to come into that room, and we'll send a facilitator. All right, we're gonna, tech support is gonna start screen sharing again. So go ahead and pop yourselves back on mute if you're not speaking. I hope everybody enjoyed getting to know one another in your breakout sessions. So we're gonna continue on with here. All right, so how can we use JEDI principles in our organizing? On the next slide, we're gonna talk about how to show up for frontline communities. And there's a great resource, definitely read this because it's where a lot of this curriculum is pulled from, with permission from the wonderful ladies who wrote that article. There's a reason for engaging frontline communities. Like, this is how we win on climate. We know that this is a climate crisis, and we can't rely on all the environmental nonprofits alone to tackle it. And we recognize that as 350 organizers, we have to recognize that. We have to know that by combining the resources of the national organizations and the NGOs across the country with the experience and knowledge of those most impacted, you know, the low-income folks, Black, Latino, First Nations, we can build a diverse and powerful coalition for climate justice. Frontline communities have given advice. Like, here is, we're gonna go through starting on the next slide. Here's their advice, like our advice on how to really help frontline communities. So number one, we need power and adequate funding. And I think that's one of the most common criticisms of NGOs and foundations is that they swoop down into communities, you know, to run events, and you know, they offer an insufficient grant, and then they swoop back out. Like, they just want to come in and do that for their organization. It's always offered on their terms, and the community is expected to be grateful. We can do better than this. Working with frontline communities really requires a genuine partnership, where the community leads the process, has access to the experts and the funds to cover those costs. And this is an important thing about knowledge and resources, is that we need to stop the gatekeeping with the foundations and the funding, because when we empower smaller grassroots groups, if we're going to preach that we're grassroots and we're bottom up organizing, and we do this on people power, then we have to open up that funding to our BIPOC and frontline groups so that they have just as much access to the money as the big NGOs. So we welcome your knowledge and resources. While residents must lead the process, the movement and its funders bring the knowledge and the resources. So our local and state politicians, take note when we have national and regional organizations backing us and money in our pockets, and partners and experts are more likely to join forces. Truly welcome all of these things, but under the terms of that frontline community. Next slide. Helping means staying. So, this just, we're running out of time. We have like a half hour left, so I'm not going to read these whole things, but you have to stick around. You have to stay there through the successes and the failures and elevate voices. It's not a profession for folks in frontline communities, although frontline work is real work. The people that you work within these communities are suffering from the impacts of climate change. Like, this is first and worst. When we use those words, those buzzwords of who is hit first and worst, we need to recognize that those are our frontline communities. And these people, folks, like, we have lost homes in fires and floods and extreme weather events, livelihoods and assets as a consequence of this. And there's a constant barrage of environmental injustice. One of the ladies, who wrote this lives in Port Arthur, Texas, which is home to the nation's largest oil refinery and some of the highest levels of toxic air releases in the country. And asthma and cancer rates in the predominantly Black West Side are among the highest in the state. These folks, they care deeply about their environment, and it's not their profession. This is where they live. So we need to engage them with thought and care, put food on the table, offer childcare, and host events at times and places that work for them. And that might be inconvenient to us as organizers, but we have to do that. Next slide. Frontline communities aren't experts. We aren't scientists or experts on resilience, and welcome and need technical assistance. But we are experts on our community and how the impacts of climate change are playing out. We can show you the watermarks of flooding and point to where they spill over. We can share the stories of neighbors who have escaped or our own stories. We also know that building resilience is as much about social and environmental assets as it is about science. And we know who and what those assets are. Ditch most of the toolkits. Guidance documents, best practice case studies, and toolkits may work well for city governments, but they aren't for us, except when they are developed by us. Please come directly to our community, meet with our people, let us show you what we know, and then share your knowledge and resources with us. Next slide. All right, we are environmental activists. There's a false belief that people of color and low-income Americans don't care about the environment or climate change, and that someone must persuade us to care. But research and our own experience show us otherwise. We don't need a lesson on why we should care. We need solutions. Accept conflict. We like to partner with our cities and counties, truly. But sometimes they're, looking out for those development dollars and neglect the concerns, meaning that the fight is with them. Climate justice is political, and we need partners willing to accept politics and conflict. And don't lead with retreat. Some people say, if you're flooding, why don't you just move? Come on now, really? We recognize that we know the vulnerability of these communities to climate change, to sea level rise, to flooding, to fires. We know that some neighborhoods, they're gonna have to move. But first, you have to spend time building trust. And research shows that the government is quick to armor the homes of wealthier communities while declaring, the poor neighborhoods unsalvageable. And those of us who live in and fight for frontline communities welcome assistance in the form of resources and expertise. But the best way to help isn't just by helping, it's by seeing frontline communities as equal partners and allies and accomplices in the struggle for climate justice. All right, next slide. So this is going to come out. These resources are going to come out. I keep seeing comments in the chat that where are these resources? We promise to email these to you. You will get this whole shebang, like the slide deck, all of it. So I'm not going to read through all of these, but these are some examples of how you can show up for frontline communities and how you can organize in these spaces. Next slide. We have to use a JEDI lens in all of our organizing. So we have to understand both sides of this. The original guide, describes the 4 important features of a racial equity lens, but a racial justice lens adds 4 more critical elements to that. So definitely using all 8 of these when you're looking at your campaigns, when you're looking at organizing in your community, when you're looking to work with a frontline community, whatever you're trying to organize, if you look at it with a racial equity and racial justice lens, your organizing will be 10 times stronger. Next slide.
Thank you, Amy. So when we talk about all of this knowledge on racial justice, racial equity lens, we really have to remember to use an intersectional approach. So just to kind of explain the term intersectionality was coined by the renowned law scholar and critical race theorist Kimberly Crenshaw, and it was introduced in her 1989 paper, Demarginalizing the Intersections of Race and Sex, a Black feminist critique of anti-discrimination doctrine, feminist theory, and anti-racist politics. So intersectionality refers to the different ways in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination, so racism, sexism, classism, all combine and overlap to intersect on the experiences of marginalized individuals and groups. So In short, intersectionality is a framework that must be applied to all social justice work. A framework that recognizes the multiple aspects of identity that enrich our lives and experiences, and that compound and complicate oppressions and marginalizations for each individual. So if we don't acknowledge the systems of oppression that are attributed to certain groups of people's identities, then we will never be able to gauge the detrimental harm that certain communities face because of their overlapping identities. So in order to have true climate justice for all, we must first understand this principle of intersectionality. Next slide. So when we're thinking of intersectionality, it's very much a learning tool that we have to practice over time. So how can we practice it? So the first way to start is by self-reflection. So we have to deliberately look within ourselves and understand ourselves and see where we feel challenged when we have these conversations. So we have to have this desire to learn about issues and identities that don't necessarily impact us personally. Secondly, we have to be willing to call people in. So when people call each other in and out, which is like the idea of, let's say someone does something that is harmful. Oh, we were talking about impact versus intent. So let's say maybe the intent wasn't to be harmful, but the impact was harmful. It's important that we call each other in or out in order to have retribution and to learn from that situation. So calling people in and out can be an act of love because it's about holding people accountable and making sure that they work to be intersectional and serve everyone in the space. So rather than taking it personally or becoming defensive when, let's say, you're called out or called in, recognize that being called out is not really about you or your worth as an individual. It's being used for you to grow and learn from this moment so that you can be a better activist in the future. Third, try to decenter your perspective. So let's say for someone who is middle class, it's easy to fail to understand the issues of poverty in the Black community, despite being otherwise knowledgeable about some issues of race. So it's important that we pay attention to the fact that it's about more than ending a single issue. It's about ending all of the interconnected systems of oppression that affect different people in different ways. So be willing to make mistakes. So this goes back to our idea of calling in and out. It is okay to not be perfect. We're not looking for perfectionism, and we have to learn from mistakes in order to grow and continue this work. So adapting an intersectional framework is not an easy process. It involves seeking to understand things that are difficult for you to understand and empathizing with people who are not like you and stepping back instead of speaking over others and opening yourself up to a high level of accountability. So it's less constructive to avoid mistakes and then bristle at criticism than it is to be open to learning, growing, and self-correcting as part of a continuous process. So when you inevitably mess up and are called out for something, how you respond truly does matter. Next one. So intersectionality also is not here for your comfort. Intersectional organizing is difficult. And if you're doing it right, it should be challenging to you and helping you grow and making you uncomfortable. But it's not here to make anyone comfortable. It's quite the contrary. So intersectionality should be making everyone uncomfortable because we never grow or progress when we are comfortable. We grow when we are hurting or struggling or stretching ourselves to understand something new. So the journey towards intersectionality is difficult, and you will make mistakes. We all will. But if you want to realize relationships, communities, or societies built upon justice, we have to keep doing this work. So when we think about intersectionality, especially as climate activists, it's important for us to understand how intersectionality affects climate injustice as a whole. So when we think of environmental injustice, we think of environmental harm that's directly caused from our changing climate, the deterioration of our planet. So in some ways, that environmental injustice manifests itself as through global climate catastrophe, natural disasters, extreme weather patterns, loss of natural resources, migration of people and animals, increase of pandemics, widespread diseases. If you have any more examples, please feel free to put them in the chat. But when we think of racial injustice, we have to think of societal harm that's caused directly from systems of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. So some examples of those are white supremacy and anti-Blackness, lack of political media representation, poor quality public education, loss of natural resources, disproportionate incarceration rates. So when we mix those two together and we see how the oppression of environmental injustice and racial justice overlap, we get climate injustice. So that's where we have situations like redlining, environmental racism, food apartheid or lack of access to healthy foods, poor air qualities, hazardous waste being put in Black and brown areas, or lack of access to public transportation. So this intersection of environmental and racial injustice is climate injustice, and it helps us understand that when we fight for both environmental and racial justice, we fight for true climate justice.
All right, this is a good question. So what do you mean climate justice and social justice? Are they the same thing? They're one and the same. Next slide. So some of the intersections of these two things. Energy justice. African Americans spend on average 41 billion on energy, yet only hold 1.1% of energy jobs and gain less than 0.01% from the energy sector. Utility justice is an intersection. Communities of color and low-income communities pay the biggest price for dirty energy. Shutoffs during the pandemic is also a form of systemic environmental injustice. And a good example of that, like utility justice, where we're talking about that they pay the biggest price for dirty energy. Not only do they pay more, but they also live and work and play next to fossil fuel infrastructure many times. Like in downtown Denver, there is the Suncor tar sands refinery. There's a tar sands refinery like right north of downtown. And that community that lives there is directly affected by that infrastructure. Or the coal plants. In Pueblo, they don't even get the energy that's produced by that coal plant, doesn't even power their community. It goes out of state, yet they are affected by the pollution. Next slide. Another intersection is youth activism. Frontline youth have always been the forefront of movements for justice and social change, always, from the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, the American Indian movement, to the Puerto Rico independence movement, Sunrise movement, and Black Lives Matter and Standing Rock. Youth climate activists, they go to the front lines of fossil fuel fights all over the country. They've gone on strike from school, take to the streets, disrupt major events, and lobbied members of Congress to pursue action against the biggest existential threat to humanity. And this affects them not only, it's very inspiring, yes, like the youth, like they go y'all. But the way that this really affects them is that if you talk to your kids, like if you're a parent, and you talk to your kids, I'm a millennial of a parent of Gen Z. And when I talk to my oldest about how his generation feels about the climate crisis, they have really, a lot of them, those of them who are not active as frontline youth, their biggest thing is like, they've already resigned themselves to the fact that their planet is trashed and that they're going to grow up and live in a post-apocalyptic society. Like that's their reality. So it affects their mental health, their physical health, and affects how they see themselves coming into this world. And as adults, we have a responsibility to support them when they want to fight for change.
And next, in a very important group is the LGBTQIA+ community. Because once we stop seeing these fights for humanity as separate, we open ourselves up to the possibility of learning from each other in deeper ways. For queer folks, mass incarceration uniquely affects their communities, as Black and Latinx queer youth are overrepresented in the juvenile justice system, and queer adults are overrepresented in prison and jail. When you start to recognize that prisons are often built on the environmental hazard sites such as coal ash dumps, it becomes very clear that one single issue has many, many layers of oppression. The fight for queer rights is often interwoven with the fight for justice for the earth and for its people. Right now, your social media feeds might be returning to normal, but for so many Black, queer, and trans folks, normal includes a litany of injustices that no one should be subjected to, from insecure housing to violence to criminalization, police brutality, medical racism. The most important thing that we can do right now is listen to Black radical visionaries and keep fighting for justice until all Black lives matter. So in regard to migration and immigration, I feel like a lot of us have a lot of knowledge on this section specifically because we are climate activists, but we understand that the climate crisis, which is fueled by capitalism, colonialism, imperialism, is making many parts of the world inhospitable. So this goes back to our disposable peoples and communities and societies. Because of this crisis, the climate fueled movement of people is already well underway. Between the states, the regions, and countries, as areas become less habitable, I can't speak. I'm so sorry. As less people are in these areas, we see our sea levels rise. We see droughts and fires, severe storms, hurricanes, loss of property, unsafe drinking water, crop loss, loss of tourism. So this is where we really start to see all of these environmental justices start affecting our areas and our communities. So additionally, in environmental justice contexts, it's important to note that xenophobic narratives, as well as many common definitions of who and who isn't an immigrant on this land, fail to acknowledge the history of colonialization committed by the United States government and the fact that this country exists on land that was stolen from its indigenous caregivers. Explicitly making these connections within our work and acting in solidarity with communities and groups fighting for environmental justice is also strategic. The more we are able to connect with the struggles of others and incorporate actions of solidarity into our work, the more long-lasting the impacts of our movements will be. When we are better able to understand, I'm still on this slide, one second, sorry. When we are better able to understand, acknowledge, and integrate the needs of all communities into our demands and vision for a better future, our movements will have more power and reach a greater audience.
And I was on mute. All right. Another intersection of this is violence against Indigenous women, girls, and people fueled by fossil fuel man camps. The statistics are staggering. Our women and girls are taken from us in an alarming way. Native women are murdered at a rate 10 times higher than that of others. And it's the third leading cause of death in our communities. The majority of these murders are committed by non-Native people on Native-owned land. But because of the lack of communication between state, local, and tribal law enforcement, it's really difficult to begin the investigation process. And when you see these fossil fuel man camps go up near infrastructure projects, these men, where do you think they're gonna go? What do you think they're gonna do? And this violence is perpetuated everywhere that there is fossil fuel infrastructure. It hasn't ever not happened, period. And the numbers really speak for themselves. Like, it's surprising though how few people actually know that this happens. There was this statistic I saw that it was from a couple years ago. It was like 5,712 or 13 was the number of known incidents of missing and murdered Native women. And 84% of Native women have experienced violence in their lifetime. And when we talk about this, about the violence that we face, it's not just on the res. It's down the street, it's in your urban neighborhood, it's in our homes, it's around fossil fuel infrastructure. It's everywhere, it happens. So this is an intersection. This is something that happens when the fossil fuel industry comes into a community. These are the repercussions for our communities. Which brings us to pipelines and fossil fuel infrastructure through sacred land. When you think of all these pipelines and all these big pipeline fights from Standing Rock to KXL to Line 3, Atlantic Coast, TMX, Trans Mountain, Appalachian Trail, Jordan Cove, like there's been so many of them. But the land defenders, the people who defend the land, are affected in more, it's hard for me to even articulate sometimes when I think about like the massive impact that it has on these communities. And one of the biggest examples that we're seeing right now in real time is the Line 3 pipeline on Anishinaabe land in Minnesota. And I was thinking about this as I saw some of the comments in the chat rolling in, you know, about how to show financial reciprocity to Rachel and myself for putting this work together. Literally, this is our job. Like, this is what we do. And we do this and we put these together so that we can help other local 350 groups and other grassroots groups really dig into organizing. So if you want to throw down financially, donate to GNU Collective or Northfield Against Line 3, like throw down for the front lines, because they are the ones who are defending the water, the wild rice, the salmon, everything in these areas. When Enbridge, one of the, you know, those big companies, they come in and they just decimate the area and put the water of millions at risk. There is no better thing you can do than donate to GNU Collective. And I'll put that in the chat. It's GINIW for those of you who are looking it up. And I will grab a link closer to the end. That's a donate link. Or donate to your local 350 group. If there's a local 350 group in your area, like throw down some cash in that direction and help get a grassroots campaign off the ground locally. But then I'm going to turn it back over to Rachel.
All right, thank you. So speaking of fossil fuels in general, a lot of us can think back to the movement for Black Lives that took a large peak once again, bringing this up. But from this past summer, we saw so many people come out to protest over the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, just racial injustice in general. So we all can recognize that a large part of the US got a firsthand look at the Black experience and saw the manifestation of centuries of racial dehumanization and anti-Blackness for the first time. But movements like the Movement for Black Lives have understood that to be completely liberated, there needs to be an intersectional approach to the work that they do. In their invest and divest demands, they call for the investment of education, health, and the safety of Black people, rather than the continual investment in Black criminality and Black death. They also understood that in order for Black liberation to be successful, these investments into the Black community need to be determined by Black communities. They understood that the investment in fossil fuels, police, surveillance, and corporate power all work against the liberation of Black lives. Next one. So in their campaign, Defund the Police, they understand that we must cut the astronomical amount of money that our government spend on law enforcement and give that money to more helpful services like affordable housing, counseling services, violence prevention programs, and community services that benefit the people, benefit the people and not the militarized police forces who harm communities of color. And this is the same idea for their divest in and divest out, because by doing this, by focusing on how we can change this environmental injustice or this racial injustice and make that go into a positive way and investing into this community is an intersectional approach at liberation. Sorry, next one. So I just wanted to share this quote with you all from the former North America director of 350.org, Tamara Tolles O'Laughlin. So she said, from policing to financial violence, the road to solving the climate crisis includes addressing connected predatory systems. We support the demand to defund and divest from the police and fossil fuels and to reinvest in the resilience of people and planet for a just recovery. Next slide. So there are just so many intersections, and every facet of life is affected by climate change. And I'm sorry that we kind of had to give you nuggets of so many different information. Well, I'm not sorry, because I'm glad that we got to introduce all these topics in this conversation. But we are really excited for you all to continue to learn about these things that you read today and do more research on how the intersection of all these topics work together towards the fight for climate justice.
All right, so here's some resources. This is our resources page. And again, we're going to share this with everyone. Y'all will have access to this. And I will share the link right before we wrap up for the day. So if you want to dive into this right after you get on this call, that it is available to you. So just a great list of resources. I mean, from Surge to Organizing for Power for M4BL, some racial justice and equity tools on how you can really really dive into this work. This is, you know, this is an 1.5 hour training. And I feel like we could spend like 3 days on all of the topics that we talked about today. So definitely dive into those resources. And when it does hit here in the chat, there will be a link for some of the other stuff that I've been talking about, like donating to the front lines. I added that for you. Next slide. Okay. So we just wanted to give you, we're going to do Q&A at the end. I'm going to pause on this slide. I'm going to go to the next slide because it's 1:27 and where I live, Mountain Time. We can do that at the end so that we make sure we get all the information to folks and respect everyone's time. So the 350 Network Council has put on these series of 5 trainings. And the Network Council is all of the biggest 350 local groups we are our own organizations. Like I come from 350 Colorado. We have our own 501c3, as all of these do as well. We all have staff and we all participate in what's called the Network Council, where we all come together once a month, sometimes more, especially in the working groups that we have, like this one, the trainings working group, to put on these trainings and to work on justice and equity and to really help drive the policy of 350 all over the country. That's what these big groups do. So this is just a real quick snapshot of the groups that belong to the Network Council. And then on our next slide, I just want to remind folks that we have 4 more trainings coming up, and I am really excited about these. Our next one is strategic messaging, and that's 2 weeks from today, and that will be hosted by 350 New Hampshire. And I got a little sneak peek at their curriculum, y'all. You should be excited. It is going to be on point. And before you go, we're going to share just a survey that we would love it if y'all could just take a minute and take this survey and let us know how we did today, because we all know as organizers, the best way that we learn is feedback, and from hearing from you all. What did we do good? What could we have done better on? What did you like the most? There's some great questions in there that we hope you'll answer to help us drive these trainings in the future, because the survey from last year really helped us make this year's go a lot better. And then I think the last slide in the deck, I tried to put one in. It doesn't do it for the person who's screen sharing, but I took a screenshot of the word cloud that we made, and I added a very the last slide at the end. I made one for y'all so that you can see what our word cloud looked like from the beginning. So that's what our word cloud looked like. And Rachel and I, we would like to thank you all. This is a lot of people for us in a training. This is amazing to have this many folks join us for a training. So thank you for joining us. We're super grateful. The work of all of our local 350 groups, whether they have paid staff or not, volunteers or not, we are all doing great work across the country. And we all know to change everything, we need everyone. So thank you very much for joining us today.